plant.
That would bypass kind of the
I mean,
more industrial
state of the
or
art.
heavy commercial.
Then you could have done more with Chapman.
We ready?
because you
Yeah, I've
take
been
all
negligent.
that
Yeah, you
Pass-through traffic.
Gentlemen,
Sorry.
good evening. Welcome to the Town of Farragut's Board of Zoning Appeals for Wednesday, August 23, 2017. The chair notes that it is slightly past 7 o'clock. We have an agenda with 4 items on it this evening. The first one is the approval of minutes for the July 26, 2017 meeting. Has everyone had an opportunity to review those minutes?
Yes.
All right. Do we have any questions, comments on them? Anything that needs to be corrected?
Mark? Anything?
I don't have any unless you all have any.
None.
All right. Do I have any motions?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All right. All in favor of approving the minutes? Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right. Second item
You want to sit here? Oh, sorry.
on the agenda is a public hearing on a request for a variance from Section 14-407, subsection 5 of the town's sinkhole ordinance related to the requirement for a minimum floor elevation of 1 foot above the sinkhole lip elevation as applied to Lot 60 in Phase 3 of the Sheffield subdivision, 614 Witherspoon Lane, .267 acres, zoned R1/OSR. David B. Pfizer, is that correct, applicant?
Yes.
All right. And is the applicant here?
My name is Russ Rackley with Rackley Engineering. I'm the applicant's representative. Bear with me for a minute.
All right. If we can go ahead and swear on all those who will be giving testimony in this matter. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you'll be providing to this board will be the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you?
I do.
All right. And we'll get back and ask when you testify about your name and things, but first we'd like to hear from the town as is customary.
Okay, this property was actually platted back in 2016 as part of Sheffield Subdivision Unit 3. At the time of platting, there was a sinkhole identified on Lot 59, and as part of the town's sinkhole ordinance, there was a 50-foot building setback line put around that, and you can see that on this graphic here. It shows the sinkhole and then the 50-foot building setback line, which is also defined as a sinkhole area under your ordinance. On this one, it's a little bit harder to see on this, but they shot some spot elevations, and you can see some of the spot elevations there in the road. And also, there's a spot elevation that doesn't, well, it's right above the 0 in Lot 60. It's at 936.7 feet, whereas the sinkhole lip elevation is at 943.5. And the way the town's ordinance is set up, there's a minimum floor elevation or a finished floor elevation that's imposed that's 1 foot above the sinkhole lip elevation, really under 2 cases, and that's the interpretation that we had to make in this case. So we reviewed the application. We determined that the variance may not be necessary in this case because we're not sure that the finished floor elevation applies to the portion of the lot that falls outside of the 50-foot setback line. That area is not within the defined sinkhole area, and it's also not within the defined sinkhole drainage area. And in your packets, you have a copy of the ordinance that's Exhibit B. Over on page 2 of that ordinance, there's a definition section, and in those definitions, it defines both sinkhole area and sinkhole drainage area. And then on page 4 of the ordinance is where the finished floor elevation requirements come in, and it's in Part 5 of the ordinance. And that Part 5 is building construction in sinkhole drainage areas. And then down in one of the last paragraphs in that Part 5 section, it speaks to the finished floor elevation of any habitable structure within the sinkhole area shall be at least 1 foot above the sinkhole lip elevation. Well, so it's being tagged to sinkhole area, which is defined by the ordinance, and it's within a section that comes into play within sinkhole drainage areas, which is also defined by the ordinance. So given that the portion of the lot that falls outside of that 50-foot setback line is not located within the defined sinkhole area, and it's also topographically not part of the sinkhole drainage area, we didn't think, that finished floor elevation should be applied outside of that 50-foot line. So if you agree, if the board agrees with our interpretation, then they wouldn't need a variance as long as they build outside of that 50-foot line.
Quick question.
Sure. Does that make sense?
If I understand correctly, then what we're saying is, with regard to Lot 59, that anything within the circled area is the sinkhole area.
Yeah.
And in terms of sinkhole drainage area, is defined as the contributing surface drainage area to a sinkhole.
Sure.
But just looking at the exhibit that we have with the sinkhole area, I wouldn't necessarily know where the sinkhole drainage area was, because it could be beyond the sinkhole area, couldn't it?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And we did check that on the topographics, and also the developer or the property owner did shoot those spot elevations. So again, you can see that the spot elevation on lot 60, which is the lot in question, there is at 936.7. So it's actually below the sinkhole lip elevation, and so it's topographically below. So it's not draining. It's not draining upslope.
Sure.
Can't do that, yeah.
And as you understand the request, then, the request isn't to build anything within the sinkhole area or to alter anything, any requirement, because nothing is being proposed to be built within the sinkhole area?
Well, the request was from a variance from the finished floor elevation. They were concerned that when they built, they were going to have to elevate the building so high relative to the ground level on the lot that they'd have the building quite a bit above, the surrounding buildings. They'd have to go up. I think in the application it was, somewhere around 11 feet is what it was. So the requested variance was from the finished floor elevation requirement that's contained in Part 5 there of the sinkhole ordinance. So that's what we reviewed, and in reviewing it and in looking at the site topography and in the wording of the ordinance, we didn't feel that the area outside of that 50-foot line met either condition. It was not located by definition in the sinkhole area, which is the sinkhole plus the 50 feet, and topographically, that area outside the 50-foot was not draining back into the sinkhole. So that's...
Sure. And so I guess that by saying that, then you have something that shows you where the footprint of the construction is to occur, and that's not within the 50 feet of the sinkhole area.
They have not submitted a building footprint. They just merely requested a variance from the finished floor elevation. So that's what we reviewed.
Okay. Does anyone have any other questions of the town? All right. We'll hear from the applicant. If you would please start by stating your name and your address.
My name is Russell Rackley, representing David Pfizer. My address is P.O. Box 30456, Knoxville, Tennessee, 37922. And I guess we were a little confused because obviously there's not, or maybe not obviously, I shouldn't say that, but there's not enough area outside of the buffer to build a home on Lot 60. Our request for a variance from the finished floor, because the natural pre-existing topography as well as the constructed topography of the road location in Lot 60 and Lot 61 and the roads across the street are lower than and outside of the lip elevation of this small depression that sits on the shoulder of a ridge. The drainage area is actually uphill going into It's about 3/4 of an acre plus or minus, going up what was the Phase 2 road going up onto the ridge. It's kind of a small anomaly. It's, generally when you think sinkholes, you think of a big hole in the ground that takes a lot of water and it goes somewhere. There's not a lot of area draining to this depression to begin with. But no, our request from the variance, from our understanding of reading Part 5 of 14407, which is titled Construction in Sinkhole Drainage Area, which could be hundreds of acres, depending on where the sinkhole's at. But then every other reference in that section is to sinkhole areas, including the four measures, A, B, C, and D, that must be met in order to construct a habitable structure in this 50-foot buffer, along with the requirement for a minimum finished floor elevation of any habitable structure within the sinkhole area, which would be the sinkhole and the 50-foot buffer. So that's what we're asking for a variance from, because it would require the house to be the finished floor 11 feet above the road and 11 feet above lot 61, which isn't feasible to construct that way. Those four requirements in Part 5 can all be met. It's the minimum finished floor elevation that cannot be met realistically, and in our opinion, since it is downhill and outside of the drainage area and lower than the lip elevation, that a minimum floor elevation is not really required. The logical reason for a minimum floor elevation around a sinkhole is if the sinkhole ever becomes flooded or inundated, you don't want the house or the mechanical systems becoming inundated with water. But in this circumstance, physically, that could never occur. So that's what we're respectfully asking a variance from.
Alan, I might be confused.
Okay.
Are you, in your variance request, you're not asking to build anything within the 50-foot of the sinkhole area?
Yes.
You are.
Our understanding was that the Part 5 list that four conditions, A, B, C, and D, of which they can all be met. The final plat was recorded with note 14 that states regarding the 50-foot, literally quote, regarding 50-foot setback on lot 59 and 60, construction must comply with Town of Farragut sinkhole ordinance. So we thought that was to give us the ability to provide the geotechnical report, item D, the geotechnical report demonstrating that there's no increased danger of any kind of issue with constructing in this area than any similar building in any other area. Item C, the Tennessee Department of Environment Conservation does not require a 50-foot setback from the lip elevation. They only regulate stormwater going into a sinkhole and anything within the closed contour depression itself, any kind of fill or modification. They don't have a requirement for a setback. Item B, about no hazard to groundwater. Obviously, all of the runoff from this area is controlled by road gutters and catch basins and swells that go to the detention pond. And then item A, that the drainage function of the sinkhole will not be compromised. Well, obviously, nothing from lot 60 drains to the sinkhole, so there would be no compromising of that. So we thought that those were achieved with the exception of providing the geotechnical report for item D, basically an engineered foundation from the borings that we did on the property to refusal to bedrock, analyzing the subsurface soils for any indication of any type of sinkhole activity or propensity for a greater increase of subsidence or dropout activity there versus anywhere else in this area, which we have that report. That report has not been provided to staff, however. I apologize for that.
We'd need to see that for sure.
Yeah. Well, my understanding was with the finished floor elevation on the plat, none of that other stuff matters because I can't build a house on stilts 11 feet above the road. And so I thought the first step would be to get a variance on the minimum finished floor within the setback on lot 60, and then from there we can address the other things. And so that's where maybe I was confused on the process or procedure here.
Yeah, actually, that would probably be a planning commission action, because under your ordinance, it's the planning commission that determines, at the time of plating, the identification of the sinkhole, and then the plating of that 50 foot. So this lot would have to be replatted to remove that, and that type of information would have to be submitted to the planning commission to make that determination whether or not they were going to alter that, that setback line, and whether it was needed. And also, under the ordinance, it's more than just a drainage issue, but it's also, the structural issue.
Certainly.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, well, just like Knox County, you can build in the 50-foot buffer in Knox County, providing you provide the engineered foundation to support it, and these other criteria that you're not deteriorating the viability of an active sinkhole, which this one's not. But
And really, that should have probably been done at the time of initial plating. If the developers and didn't think lot 60 was buildable, they shouldn't have platted it that way.
Well, this is probably a conversation that, but a lot of times we weren't going to hold up the other 47 lots for one lot because of timing and needing to stay on track with sales and everything. And we platted this in 1 year ago, almost to the day, and we've got 5 lots left. So obviously we had to get going. And the date on the geotechnical report is 2016. I mean, I've had it for a couple of years, but we've been waiting on really till we needed it. And a lot of that's my fault on not being clear on how to approach resolving this situation. And I know Shipley and I had a lot of conversations leading up to the plat and with the surveyor and going back and forth. And it just seemed like it was at an impasse, and the only way to move forward was to put the finished floor on there to meet the ordinance, to get the plat recorded, and then address lot 60 at a later date. And I think that was even reflected in all the comments. So,
I mean, I'm reading this like he just indicated, which is in subsection 5, the paragraph leading into the A, B, C, D that you just went through and said that you could satisfy those things. It says all buildings shall be set back a minimum of 50 feet from the sinkhole lip elevation unless at the time of sinkhole determination, which is not now, the Farragut Municipal Planning Commission determines A, B, C, and D. So as a practical matter, this board would lack authority to do anything, in my opinion at least, that is to be a determination made by the Farragut Municipal Planning Commission. So with regard to those particular A, B, C, and D.
I don't mean to interrupt. Could you, what were you reading just then at the time of?
Sure, I thought that you had gone through A, B, C, and D. And
I did, part 5.
It's, 14407,
Yeah.
subsection 5.
Correct.
It's the paragraph that leads into A, B, C, and D. So there's a colon that says all buildings shall be set back a minimum of 50 feet from the sinkhole lip elevation unless at the time of sinkhole determination, again, not today, the Farragut Municipal.
That language isn't in the current one on the website, not the at the time of determination part.
Yeah. It is.
Yeah.
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 Are you sure?
It is. Yeah. Yeah, that hasn't changed.
It's at
We
the
haven't-
top.
hadn't changed.
He's like,
Russ and I had a lot of conversation about that, because my initial comment on that as a reviewer was you needed to make lot 60 part of lot 59. It's because I didn't think lot 60 as shown on the plat was buildable either. So that was something that we didn't have the evidence at that time at the planning commission stage, which is where it needs to be presented, to make a final determination on lot 60. So we, in the spirit of letting them go ahead and move forward with the project, we did agree to plat it with the understanding that once the required information was obtained, then that would go through the proper process per our ordinance.
Sure. I mean, so, I would point out section 14-407, subsection 2, which this board is intimately familiar with at this point, with regard to obstructing or building within a sinkhole. And again, I don't really read what you're trying to do as that today, or at least I don't read what you filed as being that before the board.
It should be the same. Yeah.
Anyway, so I need to file a replat to planning commission, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Well, again, we can't, we can't tell you what to do or not to do, but we would certainly,
Okay, I'll restate it. For me to seek a resolution on my issue, I need to file a replat with the planning commission of lot 60 to address these issues.
Smart.
With all the requirements in the
Yeah.
sinkhole ordinance presented to them ahead of time so they can make that
Certainly,
assessment.
that application.
Yeah, that's
Sure.
right.
Okay.
And then if the planning commission, wasn't willing to, to reduce it, or if they didn't reduce it as much as you thought they should, then at some point, I suppose you could come back to the Board of Zoning Appeals if you felt like the lot was not buildable, and then request a variance from that aspect. But I think you would have to go through the process of replatting if you physically want to eliminate the 50-foot building setback line.
Right. Or reduce it.
Or reduce it.
Or reduce the minimum finished floor requirement within it. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. All right, thank you for your time.
with those statements, would you like to withdraw your variance request at this point? Because we
Well-
have to have some sort of resolution on it.
I assume that's what I want to do. Is that what I want to do?
Yeah,
I've
you
never
can do
asked
that.
for an official variance before. I usually check all the boxes. So,
I understand.
this is the first, Mark knows that, I don't
Yeah.
come and have to
Yeah.
argue about stuff much, so.
Sure.
So,
rather
I'll
than-
withdraw.
All
Yeah.
right, very good.
Okay,
Thank you
okay,
very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. This language, it doesn't say that in there. It's crazy. Yeah, you're right. I don't know. That's, because this is, we printed that out. No, this is ours. Where's that?
Yeah, that's yours. I mean, it's what you sent me, but this is what I have.
All right, the next item on the agenda, item 3, is a public hearing on a request for a special exception to reoccupy and repair or renovate a non-conforming building at 12,640 Kingston Pike, .68 acres, Zone C1, Trent Farrell applicant. Are you Mr. Farrell? All right, good evening, Mr. Farrell.
Swear him in.
We have the town's representative. If we can go ahead and swear everyone that's about to testify. Do you swear or affirm that the information and facts you're about to provide to this board will be the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, as is customary, if we can hear from the town.
Okay, actually, items 3 and 4 are obviously related to each other. We just have two different procedural actions that would be needed to move forward on this. This one involves a special exception just to reoccupy an existing building. The applicant's requesting to reuse the existing building there in front of you at 12640 Kingston Pike. It was, as you all know, a former location of a Weigel's convenience store. It has the traditional roughly 20-foot overhang there in the front. And this building, this particular Weigel's, was actually constructed prior to the founding of the town. And so it really doesn't meet any town requirements, well, at least site-related. In fact, the lot itself does not even comply with the minimum lot size in the general commercial district. We require 1 acre lot on if somebody was creating a new lot in general commercial. This lot is a little over 6/10 of an acre, almost 7/10 of an acre. In 2006, Weigel's actually sold the property to W&L Properties, and then W&L Properties in 2014 sold it to as I understand it, the current owner, Southeast Bank Corp., who actually has the 4-story building on the other side of Way Station Trail. And the convenience store, which actually is a permitted use in C1, so it's not a non-conforming use issue. It was discontinued prior to Southeast Corp's purchase. In accordance with our zoning ordinance, since the existing building is, if you have a situation where you have a tract that has an existing non-conforming building, and it's remained vacant from a conforming use, which the convenience store was, for more than a year, then any reoccupancy of that building or structure cannot occur unless the applicant requests a special exception through the board. And in considering an application for that type of special exception, the Board of Zoning Appeals may impose reasonable conditions to try to ensure that the non-compliant structure comes into compliance as nearly as possible in a reasonable manner. You can't impose conditions that would exceed the zoning requirements that we have or exceed the value of more than half of the structure. In relation to this request to reoccupy, the staff would recommend that if you approve a special exception to allow the reuse of this, consistent with the language in our zoning ordinance, that special exception should impose some reasonable conditions that would provide for the building to be brought into compliance as near as possible and within reason, so that there's still reasonable use of the property, but the structure is actually much more compliant than it was prior to the reoccupancy. So what the staff would recommend is that that front overhang be reduced to a normal overhang. Basically in the town, when you have an overhang that protrudes more than 2 feet from the face of a building, then you measure the setback from the furthest protrusion of that structure. So the front yard setbacks in the case of this building are not measured from the face of the brick there, they're measured from that furthest protrusion. So the staff's recommendation is to reduce the width, the depth of that, and bring it into compliance with a normal overhang. And that would, the building is still going to be non-compliant in different aspects, but that would bring it closer to compliance and more consistent with the language of our zoning ordinance.
Can I make a statement?
Yes, sir.
If we do that, we might as well tear it down, because the structure will be no good then.
Okay, well, you can, that's just a staff.
It's a structural design item, that the way this is set up, it is set up on cantilevers. And with the concrete, if you take off that front cantilever, you weaken the whole rest of the structure.
Okay. Oh, I'm just giving the staff's recommendation.
Sure, please.
They could
please
certainly redevelop the whole site and build a new building that was compliant with our requirements. In fact, we have relaxed our setback requirements in general commercial to, if you put the parking to the side or the back, then the building could be as close as 20 feet from the rights of ways of the two streets. So we've got a lot more flexibility on a site like this for new construction. But that's just the staff's recommendation, again, trying to be consistent with the language in our zoning ordinance.
Shipley, what about what was the overhangs for the gas pumps? Does that pose any sort of
those would all be
problem?
removed. In fact, the applicant's proposing to bring the remainder of the site, largely into compliance, kind of like what was done over at the Ott's Barbecue location, where the building was allowed largely to remain, but they did bring aspects of that into compliance, and then also the whole site improvements were brought into compliance with the requirements at that time.
With the Ott's building, though, my memory, and again, I could be wrong, was that we didn't have the issue of it being vacant or for more than the 365 days, did we? I mean, that wasn't an issue that I'm familiar with that we had to deal with before that seems relevant to me.
Yeah, I think it had been abandoned under the language
Okay.
of our
I don't remember
ordinance.
talking about
Yeah.
that particular
It
issue.
was. I was involved in that one also.
Okay,
Yeah, I think it was a few years, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
that wasn't brought to my attention.
Now, I've asked the building inspectors about that, what he mentioned on the front, and, I mean, you can modify something structurally. I mean, anything's possible if you have enough money.
If you have enough money, yes.
But it is a monolithic slab. I mean, it's kind of a,
It's a monolithic concrete dent is
Yeah.
what it is.
so it is part of the, it's kind of weird the way they build those buildings, but it's all kind of a continuous, as I understand it.
It is. There's also a cantilever on the
System.
back of the building. The back portion of the wall, the column's like 8 feet inside the back wall, and no column on the back.
Is the history of that, was that one of the original Weigel's buildings or the first Weigel's store?
Well, I think even the new ones are built like that, aren't they?
Oh, yeah, the new ones are still built that way,
They're
but I
all-
can't, I have
I don't know
spoken to
why, but
Weigel's,
they
and I
are.
can't get information from
Yeah.
them on
Yeah.
the concrete vents.
Yeah.
All right, does anyone have any questions of Mr. Shipley at this point? All right, we'd like to hear from the applicant, please. If you would, please state your full name and your address.
Trent Farrell, 1313 Camille Road, Knoxville, Tennessee. I am the architect who did the Southeast Bank building next door.
It's a nice building.
Thank you. A hobby project. Most of the time I design Lowe's home improvement warehouses all over the country. So, but no, what we're coming in, I guess, is the second most gorgeous site in Farragut that's still left. This and the one on the corner of Campbell Station. The bank wants to look at it to use it as office space. And it's not that we're going to go, you won't be able to tell it's a Weigel's at all. When we get done, it's going to be more something that looks like that. Still using the bones of the building to be the structure and everything, bringing it up to semi-pier coordinated with the bank. It would be having the same type brick, different items to bring it up. And as Mark stated, we have tried to make the site as compliant as we can, but we're kind of, over the years from when this was built, which it is a legacy, it's been there longer than the town of Farragut has existed. When it was first built, Kingston Pike was probably a 2-lane with a 50-foot right-of-way, and it would have been sitting way off the road. Now we're looking at a 100-foot right-of-way, which is causing the problems of not meeting the current setbacks. It has continued to lose property as the turn lane and everything has been put in for way station. And like I said, we would be bringing it up to a very attractive building and making it as close to the current requirements as we can, considering that it's already sitting there. We can't take it and move it. There's quite a few confinements on the site. Does that creek, Mark, does that creek behind it have a name, or is it just a drainage creek?
It's a tributary of the Little Turkey Creek.
Yeah.
It's pretty, I mean, we were out there a couple weeks ago, and it was flowing pretty well. I mean, it's got
It does have a pretty steady
yeah,
little
it's
flow
not
on it.
a wet weather conveyance. Or, so yeah, it's a blue line stream.
But we will be, as Mark said, the canopy for the gas pumps goes totally away. It's not involved in this at all. And even the other thing, which I think I'd probably talk the owner into, is actually taking the skeleton of the Weigel sign down. That currently really is not even on that property. It sits actually in the highway right away. That's basically it.
Do you have a suggestion? I mean, I certainly understand that it's going to look better if we let you do something. We're probably all for something looking better. I don't think any of us are against that. And you're exactly right, it's an eyesore. And we would
Excuse
like-
me?
It's an eyesore, and we would like it improved.
Yes.
Do you have something, hearing that the town is talking about making the overhang more in compliance, hearing the structural concern with that, do you have something that you can offer that would lessen its non-conforming use that hasn't been discussed? Is there something that you're doing that hasn't been pointed out yet that makes, under your plan,
Well,
a lot more conforming?
It basically is an overhang we're looking at there. We're enclosing that into a big portico along the front. We're not enclosing it into the building.
I think they're just enclosed
And-
into a portico.
As you can go further, could you go in up to the site plan, Mark?
Yeah. Yeah, I need a little bit,
I'll go
a bit
through
of
that.
clarification on that.
Yeah, can you clarify what you mean by making the front awning into a portico? Does that mean it's going to be a glassed-in area?
No, it's
What
just,
does
it's
it mean?
open air.
Okay.
It's just open air.
Does it show up on your drawing there? Because I didn't have that for the
Yeah.
packets. And keep in mind on these kind of matters,
approach the.
one thing to keep in mind,
That did not allow this.
We're friendly.
Some get down to Texas, they're not.
All right.
Okay.
Orlando's the worst, but anyway. Yeah, see, that's just open air where we would be enclosed.
Kind of like a drive-through, almost.
Well, we're not having any cars drive through it,
Right.
but it's just an open air. And if you can read the site plan that's up on the screen,
Maybe just here?
it's on y'all's screen.
Well, we've got an iconic feature back there.
Yeah, that is out at this line here.
Okay, so this, it's not just here, it runs the
It
length?
runs the whole width of
Okay.
the building.
All right.
Yeah.
And we have on the front parallel parking. One thing that we can give to be more in compliance, that Mark took us to 80 feet on the way station flag because of that one.
because of the, because of the parallel. Basically, if any part of the parking lot is in front of the building, the plane of the building, then the setbacks in C1 are 80 feet for the building. Because building setbacks are based on the parking arrangement in relation to the building.
Yeah. So if we lost that one parking place, we would be back down to 60.
If you don't have any parking in the front yard from the plane of the building, then you would change that setback. I don't know how many parking spaces you need.
The real question is,
It's,
Just making that a landscaped island, just cutting that out and
yeah, cutting that out, it would
so
just
we
be
shouldn't impose that restriction
True.
condition, so.
off to the side.
as long as none of the parking extends in front of the building plane along Way Station Trail, then you'd be held to the 60-foot setback.
We might lose one.
Yeah, it'd be a 60-foot setback under that scenario from the Way Station Trail right of way.
Yes, it is a difficult site because very small lot with 2 front yards.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Keep in mind when y'all are deliberating on this, is you really
Is there any way for us to do?
You really shouldn't base your decision on a design of an applicant at this time, because that can all change. So try not to get too caught up in that.
Sure.
You got to think about are you comfortable with the building in some configuration remaining on the site?
We do have a question. The rule that we're being asked to apply with regard to non-conforming buildings, subsection A1B, says the board, us, may not impose conditions and requirements with respect to said buildings or structures, the cost of which exceed 50% of the value of the building or structure. So I guess one question I have for you, I haven't heard anything about the value of any of this. So if the town is proposing making the overhang more normal and more in compliance, do you have any valuation with regard to the cost of that and its cost in direct comparison to the value of the building or structure?
As it sits,
Yes.
to remove that front would probably be more expensive than the cost of the building itself.
Okay.
Because of, I mean, if it was just wood frame hanging out there, it's typical structure, I would agree totally with Mark. I wouldn't be worried about it at all. But having the bad problem that I'm an architect with a master's in civil engineering structural design, it comes in that the way these vents are set up, you know, they go the positive and negative moment. It goes the negative moment at cantilever, lowers the moment over the rest of the structure. And that center beam that is over the main part of the store is designed for those lesser moments with the cantilever there. That we might have to come in, once you cut them off, and add additional structure inside the building to counteract the removement of that cantilever. And I apologize for not being better prepared on this, but I hadn't found anybody that will give me information on those bins. And until you know what actually is in them, you can't say one way or the other.
Do you know when this building was built?
1978. That information Weigels could give me. They,
That precludes.
and it wasn't that Weigels was being difficult, they just couldn't find it.
I think if you're going to use the 50% as a basis, we would have to, I would recommend the applicant would have to provide us with some reasonable evidence that, and it may be greater than 50%, but we would need, some, substantive information that demonstrated that here's an estimate of what the existing building cost, and here's what we estimate from an expert, a structural engineer or something like that, that here's what we would estimate it would cost to remove a certain portion of that front and bring it and then do the things necessary so that the remainder of the building is compliant with the applicable codes.
Did I understand correctly, with regard to the front canopy itself, are you guesstimating with regard to what is inside that structure at this point because you haven't been able to tear into it? Or are you certain that if you shorten that structure, that your calculations?
It's a guesstimate. I don't have enough information to do any calculations.
All right, that's what I heard. And so in fairness, we don't know if shortening that would be possible or not because we don't know what's inside of it.
That's correct, sir.
Okay.
And like I was about to say, if it was standard wood construction that you just had hanging out there or something, it would be no problem. But the way this works as a total unit makes it a lot more difficult to answer that question.
All right. If it were material to the board to know whether shortening that was feasible or not, is that something that could be done by some economical testing that you could bring back information if we were to continue this hearing to some other point? Or is that not worth pursuing?
It's not worth pursuing.
I'm personally not comfortable making a decision without some evidence of the cost and the value of the building.
I'd just like to bring to the board's attention, in subsection A1B, it says, as to the building structure itself, the board may impose such reasonable conditions as it may be determined so as to bring the building or structures nearly or as nearly as possible in conformity with but not exceeding current zoning. It doesn't impose upon this board a requirement to do that. It just says we may impose that. And so I think that's clear language that all the board members should be aware of, that we may impose that, but I don't see here that we have a requirement to impose something that gets it as close to conformity as we possibly can. And I want to bring that question up and make sure I'm reading that correctly.
Sure, I was reading the first paragraph of A1B. In considering an application by a party for such variance or special exception, said board shall require the applicant to comply with such then applicable rules and regulations as would be applicable to new construction upon the tract or parcel to the extent possible, and here's the caveat, insofar as such relate to matters other than the actual building or structure sought to be occupied. So I read that sentence as saying that make things applicable insofar as such relate to matters other than the actual building or structure sought to be occupied. So that may not, that may be a fair reading of what you're saying. Because then it goes on to say, as you say, the board may impose such reasonable conditions. So I guess my question then to the board is, in reading that first sentence, to the extent possible insofar as such relate to matters other than the actual building or structure sought to be occupied, this is the building or structure that's being sought to be occupied, and it seems to be saying that we should require them to bring other things up to speed, but not necessarily the building.
Right.
If I true.
And my understanding is the overhang, because it is greater than 2 feet, is considered part of the structure of the building.
Yeah, it's factored into the setback, so
Okay.
that's part of the nonconformity of it.
So I think the question before the board is with that language of may impose, I think that's the language we need to consider in making this decision, is do we feel it's, right to impose what the town has expressed their desire to be, is to shorten the length of this to 2 feet from the front of the existing structure, to shorten that.
I guess my response is I don't know the economics of it. I'd have to know how much the building's worth, what the cost would be to bring the building in compliance with what the town wants. If I found that cost was unreasonable, that might very much sway my decision. But right now, and I appreciate what you're saying, I truly believe you're an expert, and I'm not questioning your word. I just believe it's my obligation to have some kind of evidence in writing showing the cost of bringing the building into conformity as much as possible.
I guess, and in fairness to that point, when you're considering what you may do, it would be helpful to know how to balance what, that with the other competing goal of bringing it more in conformity, which gets to the point of that evidence. Let me kick it back to you again. So if we were to continue and allow a continuance to bring back some evidence
No,
of the cost, still not cost effective, not worthwhile.
no, well, one, we can't stand the time.
Okay.
Can you elaborate when you say you can't stand the time? Would it be an expensive endeavor and take a fair amount of time to get that valuation done?
Well, we'd have to wait till next month to come in here, and the owner wants to get moving. Either moving on to other options and let's just look at other options.
One thing I think it is pretty clear is that you could require all aspects of the site improvements to be brought into compliance as part of this special exception. I think that is fairly clear in the language, and I think Mike makes a good comment about the may, with the building itself, but I do believe you have the authority to require everything else to be brought into compliance.
Well, also, Mark, if you could bring up the site plan again and talking about that. As you can see, I don't know how well y'all know this site out there. Right now, there's two, what would you say, Mark, 30, 40-foot wide entranceways into that parking lot along the front there.
Free
No
for all.
buffer really between Kingston Pike and that. We now are showing, one is providing an additional, I think it's about 8 feet into the required right-of-way so that we have a 50 feet from the center line of Kingston Pike right-of-way along the front. And then holding the parking along the front 20 feet off of that new property line, which would mean that we would actually be from the edge of Kingston Pike approximately 35 feet to the front of the parking. Taking to just a right in, right out, assuming that sometime in the far future, there will be a traffic signal put on Way Station. We are narrowing the entrance off of Way Station into the site. After we lose the one parking place or something along that side over there to go to the 60-foot setback, we would just have the drive going through the site instead of, with large amounts of landscaping, we would be taking out the dumpster enclosure and a number of other items over on that side.
What about the drainage over on the east side?
On the east side, that is already existing paving there, so,
It holds water.
yeah.
I mean, it looks like a pond after a good rain there. What are we doing about that?
We have not got that far into engineering yet.
It probably due to site constraints, they'd probably have to do something like across the street with the permeable pavers, and because that was basically worked as their detention. They stored it underneath the
Well, but
subsurface.
basically on this, instead of detention, we'd have to be looking at first flush, wouldn't we?
Well, that'd be a question for the town engineer, to look at that. Certainly first flush for sure, but typically he requires detention as well, even when you're lessening the amount of coverage, which you are doing with this.
So can you summarize for me if you're not going to bring the building into, or follow Mark's recommendation for the building, what exactly on the site will you bring into conformity with the town's wishes?
Well, the items I was just discussed, we're trying to make those as much as we can, provide as much green as we can in planting areas and things along that line, and meeting the conformity of the parking setbacks and things along that line. The building sits where it sits. There's nothing we can do. But with doing the parking with the setback requirements and items along that line, we would be meeting the town's requirements on those situations.
So would the front yard setback then be at 58 foot as Mark's proposing with what you just described?
The 50-foot.
The front yard setback along Kingston Pike?
Yeah, to
would
the
that-
edge of the canopy,
Yes,
yes,
would
would
that
would be 58 feet, is that correct?
Yeah, 58 feet. Okay. So this would be, okay,
58 feet from the required right-of-way.
okay, thank
Since
you.
that's a lot of record, it doesn't have the required right-of-way memorialized at this point. They probably would have to plat it as part of the site plan process because they'll have to have a walking trail along the Kingston Pike and Way Station Trail. So they'll probably have to plat easements for that and potentially other utility-related easements or modifications to easements.
Okay. Thank you.
What is this building in comparison to Ott's as far as the setback?
This building's further away from Kingston Pike than Otts is. I don't know what the comparison is, but it is clearly further away from Kingston Pike than Otts was.
Yeah, it's been too long ago, I can't remember either, so.
I'm just making that determination based on just eyeballing it.
Well, I know
it looks
it,
closer.
In the past, we had that addition onto Otts, and that setback was something that,
As long as they didn't get any closer
Right.
to, yeah.
and it was, if that building is closer than what this one will be, with the canopy enclosed like what is on this picture, with that iconic feature, then I'm missing something that,
Well, I mean, what this particular request is just a request for a special exception, just to be able to reoccupy a non-conforming building.
Okay.
Yeah, we're kind of covering item 3 and 4 at the same time.
They're
here.
interrelated, they really are, but you have to do the first one before you move to the second one in some ways. They're clearly, in my opinion, they're expanding the nonconformity because they're adding stuff to the overhang, although I think it looks nice and I appreciate that, but they are making a nonconforming building, in my opinion, the building more nonconforming because they're adding additional improvements to that nonconforming core of the building.
to make it look better.
Yeah, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying it just,
In fact, the 58 feet gives us a little leeway, because the overhang in reality is 18 feet,
18.
and we're asking for 22 because of the step outs, try to give a little texture to the front of the building. And just the general thickness of the wall that you have to tie in, everything. We were giving ourselves a little bit of leeway there.
With respect to expansion, there is a part of the ordinance, subparagraph 2, under A, nonconforming buildings, that says nonconforming buildings and structures may be permitted to expand provided the board determines that there is a reasonable space for their expansion and that the expansion does not compound their condition of being nonconforming. So with respect to the changes that, at least in the drawing presented tonight, appear to expand the non-conforming, the condition of non-conformity. So that expansion, I think, to me becomes an issue because we would seem to be contrary if we voted in favor, that we would be expanding a condition of non-conformingness.
I agree with that.
That's,
I agree.
I think if he stayed within the footprint of what we had there, I would be more susceptible to agreeing to what he's wanting to do here.
Well, when you say stay within the footprint, can I have 6 inches?
No.
I mean, so that front edge of that canopy would have to show through.
well, I mean, even if they were enclosing even if they weren't expanding the footprint, they're still adding improvements to physical improvements to the core of the building, so that if they're enclosing the sides of it, they're really technically expanding the nonconformity of the building. I mean, the way I would have always applied that language in our ordinance.
So even if they glassed in under the canopy and just went drop dead
Yeah.
down the glassing in, just like glassing in a sun porch is expanding the
I would
non-conformity.
consider that as a violation of the expansion, the lettering as it addresses expansion.
That's a sheet metal roof.
Excuse me?
Is all this trim, is that metal?
On what trim?
The trim around the edge of the building on the front there?
Existing or what was shown on that drawing?
No, existing material that's on here.
It's just a metal flashing along the edge right there. The building was built was all precast concrete. The roof itself is precast concrete planks laid over concrete vents, 4 concrete vents. The planks cantilever off the ends. Along with the cantilevers front and back of the main vents.
Those slabs are on east and west?
Yes, sir.
How wide are each slab?
Each slab, go back to the picture of the underside of the front canopy.
It might be 8.
I can go see if the lights here kind of make this building a little glary. No, underside, Mark.
Underside?
Yeah,
Yeah,
there.
okay.
They look to be approximately 2 feet.
Each slab is 2
The
feet?
slab, if you look at it in the picture, the wider, where they have the 2 little T's coming together, the little turn down edges, that line in between is where they're butting together.
So part of the difficulty we're having now, or at least I'm having, is that basically it would be something to consider if you wanted to tear down what was over the gas pumps and improve the lot and kind of not touch the building at all other than make it cleaned up and prettier. But once we start,
Asking for the possibility.
once we're doing something beyond that, we get into the problem of compounding a non-conforming use, which seems to be a no-no under our rule.
Yes.
And
That's the way it reads.
That is the issue that we are struggling with. Because we would all like to see it improved, but we can't break our own rules to do it.
I'm not a structural engineer, but if those slabs run east and west and they're 2-foot slabs, then that appears to me that each notch in that cantilever holds a 2-foot slab. Or it actually splits the weight bearing of the 2-foot slab. That runs east and west.
That's correct, sir.
Hey, yeah, Trent, you'll probably have to give the mic if you don't mind, because we're on television.
Oh, are we?
Yeah, you're famous now.
I'm in the witness protection program. I'm not supposed to be on TV.
Uh-oh. We'll watch out for that.
Yeah.
So you've
Hey,
not.
I'm
you've
trying to
not-
understand the question, sir.
You've not checked into sawing those?
Sawing the vents or the planks?
Well, I mean, if you're going to take the 2-foot section out, what's the width of the building?
60 feet, 8 inches.
Okay, and each one of those are poured from, so you've got 4 support beams or 5?
4.
4? Okay, now is that poured continuous or is that poured between each beam?
They're just set down on each beam.
Okay.
They're just
So they
gravity.
could be removed?
Those could be removed. The planks
Okay.
themselves are not a problem. It's the main vents coming out that are the problem.
Those right here?
Yeah.
The planks, like you said, run east and west. The vents run north-south. And the vents are what has the cantilever hanging out over the front, comes down to a column. Then there's a concrete beam running across back to another column, and then there's another cantilever on the back of those main vents.
Right. Now, you're proposing to put, from your picture here, you're proposing to put this iconic feature in the front. And when I look at it, it looks like it's a walkway in. I'm not trying to tell you what to do, but to me, if I shorten that and I have support beams there, that I'm supporting my cantilever, and that would be on the north end of it.
That is correct. We were just attaching to the cantilever with non-load-bearing walls, but no, if what you're saying, if I follow you now, excuse me, I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed, but I'll try, is you're saying cut off 2 feet. Now, 2 feet we could probably do so that we're not encroaching any further out past the current line of the building.
That was the town's recommendation to start with, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, actually, what I was looking at was cutting it back to where you would have it to a normal building overhang.
Do you know how much that would be?
Well, it'd be about 2 feet from the face of the building.
Well, that wouldn't even be as the width of the sidewalk. That's in front.
Well, it could be a little wider than
Yeah.
that, but yeah, I mean,
Yeah. Well, I mean, if going to the not expanding outside the building footprint, if you took the canopy as the full building footprint edge, taking 2 feet off so that we could put those features on the front would be feasible. That would not take so much the cantilever off.
That would also support the north end of that cantilever, if so designed properly.
I don't think we'd make the front load bearing still.
Well, I mean, there's nothing there now.
Yeah, but the structure is built to be done that way.
Okay. I would have to see that original drawing. I'm missing something here because, like I said, I'm not a structural engineer, I'm just a mechanical, but when I look at a normal cantilever, if I'm going to take some of it off, okay, I need to see what's in back here. That's the back support of it. What's back there? I see nothing sticking out from the back of the building. So where's my my point?
May I walk away from the microphone?
well, if you need to show them something on the drawing, that's fine.
Well, no, actually, I want to draw on something.
All right, so that pen's dead. You can use his pen.
Here's the cantilever, and I'm going to do it very simply here. This comes like that. This is the 18 feet here. And then across here is the other structural, and then there's another cantilever off the back,
Sticking out of the back of the building?
sticking out of the back of the building.
Really?
Yeah. It has a brick wall in under it, back along that back edge.
Okay.
But I'm not worried by cutting this off the structure out here. What I'm worried about is this beam on the interior. Because if you look at the moment diagram for this, it goes something like that. Like that. And if we take this off, all of a sudden it goes up like that.
I have to disagree with that. Sorry. I don't think taking any of that off is going, I mean, I don't know what the amount is right here, but, I mean, have we got 18 feet back here?
No, this is 8 feet.
Okay.
That's 8 feet. But just, standard structural is this takes it down to a negative moment. This goes up.
I understand, but what you've got right here is a very thin portion going to here, and you've got a very thick one here.
Your moment's increasing down through here.
Naturally, yeah, but I don't, I'd have to see the plan. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I have to disagree.
I will say this, you have made what was a very uninteresting building to me absolutely architecturally fascinating. And I kind of want to just see you make it into a Maserati dealership now.
Let me tell you, I have vast experience. Try to make a Lowe's building look good.
Do we have any further questions? Or are we at the point that anyone wants to make any motions?
Just so I understand this, so right now we have a non-conforming building, and it's mostly because of the overhang.
No,
And so
no, no. No.
It's a lot.
I mean, a lot, but just,
Yeah.
yeah, so.
That seems to be a sticking point.
That certainly contributes to it.
Okay. And so, I guess my challenge is I haven't seen any compelling evidence that bringing the overhang into compliance with town ordinance would be cost prohibitive or a difficult feat. I've heard your comments, and I appreciate that, but in terms of getting back to the value of the building and the cost of improving the overhang, I've not seen any evidence in writing to show that that would be a hardship. I also believe that the improvements are beautiful, and I drive by that building every day, and I appreciate what you've done because I think the drawing is very appealing, but it still brings the building further into nonconformity from what I've heard. And so therefore, I would make a motion to deny the variance request.
Which one?
Well, this is a
Just
special
one.
exception for the reoccupancy of the non-conforming building.
This is
What,
item 3 on the agenda.
Yes, sir.
Motion on the floor. Do I have a second?
The motion on the floor is to deny, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
I suppose it's proper for me to second a motion. I've never done that as the chair, but I would second it and comment based on seconding the motion
It's discussion now.
that we're into discussion. And the thing that I'm struggling with and that is swaying my vote is the fact that this, from what I heard, we are exacerbating a non-conforming use and that we are going beyond the overhang with the current variance request that is on the floor. So right now, they've asked for more than the distance of the overhang. So not only are they talking about enclosing to some extent the overhang and exacerbating the non-conforming use, but they're going from, if I understood correctly, approximately 18 feet to 22 feet to give them some extra room beyond the overhang, if I understood that
That's
correctly.
correct.
And so, to me, that is a clear exacerbation of the non-conforming use that despite my desire to see this improved, I can't rectify with the rule that I'm faced with. And so that is my discussion on that.
My part, I don't have a problem with them reoccupying, repairing and renovating it. It's that it will be on the next one that I'll have a problem with, as far as the way that they want to do it.
I think I'm at the same position as you just stated, Alderman Williams. We may impose those reasonable conditions, but I don't see that we're required to. And the challenge becomes, we have a diagram or drawing in front of us, but I don't really take that into account because that may not be what the final building looks like, and so I can't really consider that drawing. My thought on this, if we can amend the motion, is, to say that we, yes, they can actually move into the building, reoccupy the building, provided they don't compound any nonconformity of the building. I cannot see personally imposing conditions, beyond what the footprint of this building is now. I think it would be reasonable for them to modify the structure as long as it conforms to the extent that it conforms right now. The diagram that was presented doesn't do that, but that's not to say that it can't be done. And so,
Can I join the discussion?
Hold on a second.
Okay.
just a moment. And so, I tend to lean towards reoccupancy. Again, I, along with Alderman Williams, would have serious questions when it then comes to the variance on the next item. But with respect to what's in front of us, I just want to reiterate, we're not required to impose. We may impose. And so I'd ask all the board members just to think about that language once again. And so that's kind of where I'm at with it. But I can't see, as the chairman has said, I can't see how we could compound the condition of nonconformity, as that would be contrary to what the ordinance says. So I don't know if we can amend.
I can amend my motion to allow for reoccupancy as long as the nonconformity is not further exacerbated.
And no longer be a denial then.
Well, also,
It looks to me like you would need to address the site as part of this special exception, and you do have the you almost are kind of required to make them bring that into compliance, is the way I read this.
Sure, and reading subsection A,
Exhibit C.
yeah, Exhibit C, I'm sorry. A1B, in considering an application by a party for such variance or special exception, said board shall require the applicant to comply with such then applicable rules and regulations as would be applicable to new construction upon the tract or parcel to the extent possible insofar as such relate to matters other than the actual building. So basically, we would be required in whatever we do to have the applicant comply with the applicable rules and regulations other than with regard to the building itself at this point.
Which would
may
be
I
the
say
site.
something too now? Since, in speaking of that, Ron gave me a very good idea. Taking the 2 feet off and not going outside of where the current canopy overhang is would be possible. It's just the front 2 feet so we could get the new wall inside of where the current canopy and not going outside that current canopy line.
Well, sir, the reason I disagreed with you on that is when you look at your two uprights and you look at the amount overhang on one and look at the amount of overhang on the other, if they're equal, then I don't see that you're moving it
If they're equal, I'm not.
as far as the space. You said you're 8 feet on the back side and you're 18 feet on the front side, right?
That's correct, sir.
Okay. I don't see that if you took 10 feet off of it and made it 8 feet on each side of it, I don't see that you would change anything. That's the reason I was looking at that actual reason I was looking at how they ran and what you could actually take off of it.
We'll just have to agree to disagree because I totally disagree with you.
So in terms of discussion, if I understand what he's saying, is that if we move forward, and again, we're in the discussion phase on a motion which will have to be amended and, perhaps withdrawn and restarted or something akin to that, but in terms of discussion on that, even if we had, and this might get to the next issue, I mean, if we made a ruling like we're talking about, which is that we shall require the applicant to comply with all such then applicable rules and regulations as would be applicable to new construction, and it can be phrased exactly that way. But don't place any requirements with regard to the building. Then when we move to the next one, then we address, I suppose, the building itself. Is that where we're going down the road with item 4 on the agenda?
As part of the special exception to the reoccupy, I think you can have language in the motion that talks about you're still compliant with the ordinance language. You have to make sure you're not expanding the condition of nonconformity, because that's related to the special exception.
Sure.
So
Right.
I think
That
that if you even enclose it, you're expanding the bulk of it. In
Sure.
other words, the visual form of the building changes. Even if you reduce the protrusion by 2 feet, if you enclose it, you still, in my opinion, you're still expanding it.
Well, and so I'd like the board's thoughts on that. If we take 2 feet off and we grant a variance that then encloses that, taking 2 feet off but then enclosing it, does the board have any discussion on whether or not that's exacerbating a non-conforming use?
I think that, in my opinion, I wouldn't see it that way, because from the beginning, we see this overhang as part of the structure. I would see anything that extends the structure as compounding nonconformity. But, for example, if that overhang was 2 feet and somebody decided to enclose the walkway, or 3 feet of overhang that was compliant, and they decided to expand, a glass walkway on the front to put it under cover, or enclose it, I don't see that that's changing the structure of the building, with respect to conformity, nonconformity. So I wouldn't necessarily see it that way. I would say as long as they stay within the same footprint of the building, which we have said includes the overhang, that we would not be compounding nonconformity. But I would agree that we cannot go beyond that, because then we do compound, regardless of what that structure looks like. That's my personal opinion.
I'm aware of other cases we've had before us where we had non-conforming residences with a patio or a porch that someone wanted to put a roof over, and that, it's already out there, but putting the roof over it made it non-conforming, and that became an issue. So, that's the difficulties. I can certainly see that rationale, and I'm just wondering, in the past, Mr. Shipley, do you have any memory of any matter before the board where we found that basically enclosing something that had an overhang was an exacerbation of a non-conforming use? I'm not remembering anything in a commercial context.
No, I don't. Not that I recall. No, I'm not saying we haven't.
Sure.
I think part of the reason we have setbacks is for light and, space, bulk limitations, the perception of having less bulk on a site. So when you start to enclose something, you consume more of that light and more of that space. And that's I guess where I'm coming from. Now, it might be possible to design something that would look very nice, but still leave it largely open. I don't know. That's not really any of my expertise, but I think if you're doing anything to intensify the bulk of the structure, that, in my opinion, you're expanding the condition of nonconformity.
It looks like you got 4 piers here, and that's going to go all the way across. If you look at if this is the front elevation, which it says it is, then you're going to have a pier for each one of these.
A pier and then a roof overhanging it.
Well, yeah, because the roof's already there.
Yeah. So it gets to your point, the piers are really what.
That's the support.
And again, we're not, I guess the problem is we're not married to that drawing. That
Right.
drawing could change.
Oh, sure.
It could be completely enclosed, depending on what we do, so.
Well, depends on what somebody else does.
Yeah.
It's not us.
No, exactly.
It won't be us. It'd be planning commission.
But it gets to your point, don't rely on that drawing as a basis for your decision.
Yeah.
I like the spirit of Michael's suggestion about amending the motion simply because my intent is not anymore extending the nonconformity. So I guess, do I need to reword my motion?
If your motion before was to deny it, and your motion would now be to approve it with special exceptions or special requirements, then I guess I would suggest that we withdraw that and start over.
Yeah.
Okay, I withdraw my motion.
Very good. Do I have any new motions?
Michael.
Trying to think how I want to say it.
Okay.
So I would make a motion that we approve the special exception to reoccupy and repair and renovate non-conforming building at 12640 Kingston Pike, provided that that renovation does not increase or compound the condition of nonconformity to the ordinance.
Second.
Do you want to address the site? as part
Yeah,
of
I
that?
would move to amend your motion that it also include the requirement that the applicant shall comply with all applicable rules and regulations as would be applicable to new construction upon the tract or parcel to the extent possible, insofar as such relate to matters other than the actual building.
Okay.
All right. I have a first and a second with regard to that amendment.
Who seconded that?
I'll second again.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
Clear, Mark?
Not really, but that's fine. I watch the tape.
You watch the TV?
At least it's on tape, so, yeah.
Any further discussion? All right, I'll call for a vote then. All in favor of the motion as amended, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries. All right. Last item on our agenda is a public hearing on a request for the following variances associated with the property at 12,640 Kingston Pike, .68 acres, Zone C1, Trent Farrell applicant. And there are three different items. A, front yard setback along Kingston Pike from a required 80-foot setback to a proposed 58-foot setback. B, front yard setback along Way Station Trail from a required 80-foot setback to a proposed 48-foot setback. And C, rear yard buffer strip setback from a required 35-foot setback to a proposed 33-foot setback. Is the applicant present?
I'm still Trent Farrell, last I heard.
And you remain sworn under oath. So I suppose we'll hear from the town on this one.
Well, yeah, we kind of already talked about some of this, but this is a variance rather than a special exception that deals with the setbacks. And let's see here, let me just review, trying to abbreviate what I was going to say because we've already talked about quite a bit of this. Basically, this is a non-conforming building in terms of setbacks. The setback requirement based on the parking lot is 80 feet from both Kingston Pike and Way Station Trail. what the applicant is requesting is a 58-foot setback from Kingston Pike, and then a 48-foot setback from Way Station Trail. The rear of the building backs up to property that's zoned residential, so actually behind the building there's a required 35-foot buffer strip. The building itself is situated 2 feet into part of that buffer strip, so it kind of is what it is. There's also an aquatic buffer in relation to that drainage area, and the building, of course, is within part of that as well. This is, as I mentioned earlier, a substandard lot, and again, I think to be consistent with the language that's provided in our zoning ordinance as it relates to variances, and to be equitable in our treatment of others and fair in our application of the regulations. What the staff refers to, is the language that we have to go by, and that's our standards for granting variances, which are provided for in our zoning ordinance. And one of those standards is that if you do grant a variance, it shall be the minimum adjustment necessary for the reasonable use of the land. So that's, again, what the staff was getting at with the previous item, was to try to bring that building into compliance to the greatest extent possible, and still allow for a reasonable use of the property. Obviously, the core of the old Weigels area can be reasonably used. It served as their primary area for their convenience store. The overhang's just kind of part of their design. It really didn't necessarily directly affect the use of the property. So it, with the removal of the overhang, they could still certainly have reasonable use of that existing structure. So again, that's what the staff's recommendation would be, consistent with our language in the zoning ordinance, to again look for the minimum adjustment necessary if we are going to provide for an adjustment in this case.
Does anyone have any questions of Mr. Shipley?
So I guess, Mr. Shipley, I'm having a hard time seeing this drawing, but what would the setback be from Kingston Pike and from Way Station to the actual building structure itself, not including the overhang? Would that be compliant with?
Well, it lessens the amount of variance. It still is going to be slightly it certainly will be non-compliant from Way Station Trail, but it does reduce the amount of non-compliance by about 3 feet, and it reduces the amount of non-compliance from Kingston Pike setback from 22 feet to roughly 2 feet. So, a pretty substantial reduction in the amount of relief that would be needed should that covered area be lessened. There's really nothing we can do about the east side or the south side of the building, as it's would be really unaffected by what you do with the overhang, because it's not going to improve the condition in that regard.
Are we now looking at what definition of building is? Because from the previous approved item, it's the way I was understanding the way y'all were reading it, that in approving a non-conforming building, that it looked at only the side items and not the building itself. All side items being called into conformance, not the building itself. That's the way I was understanding the reading.
That's a different kind of action. I mean, that's related to the special exception, and there's certain parameters that are related to that particular request. That's why that was specifically broken apart from the variance request, because in order to have a variance, you first of all have to have an action taken on the request to even reuse the building. So they're just
I was just going
different.
by what they were
The
reading.
variance that you're looking at, the form of the building, assuming that you can reuse the building now that you could under the action that was taken, but then the condition is that you wouldn't be expanding the degree of nonconformity. So then that kind of relates to what we're talking about now with the variance.
Well, increasing the area of nonconformity. But if we're staying within the existing building footprint, we're not increasing the nonconformity.
Well, as I said earlier, I think if you enclose it, I think from my perspective, you would be expanding the amount of nonconformity.
That's the reason I was asking, are we discussing building, what is the building definition?
Yeah, a building is a structure with a roof over it, so that overhang is part of the building.
And that's why I said is that
It is a structure. The parking lot's a structure, but a structure with a roof over it becomes a building, the way we apply it in our zoning ordinance.
Yeah, but that's what I was just saying, from what your zoning ordinance said earlier, that once it was approved as a non-conforming building, it only had to meet the site variance requirements, not the building itself.
Yeah, as long as the building wasn't expanded to
Which-
exacerbate its condition of nonconformity.
Right, and if we're not expanding the building, which I had stated, we can take 2 feet off that front canopy. We just can't take 16 feet off of it.
Well, what I would refer to in the case of this request are the provisions that relate and the standards that relate to granting variances, not special exceptions, because there's different requirements for the variances. And
I
those
must
are
have misunderstood, because the way they were reading it, the building was excluded from those.
just related to the special exception of reusing it. They're different actions, that's why they
Oh,
were
I know, I
broken
understand they're
out.
different actions,
Yeah.
but I thought in the original action, the way Keith was reading it, it stated that the building, it was in non-conformance, therefore the building was accepted as it said, without having to meet the current setback requirements.
Well, I mean, that's related to the special exception. I mean, you still need to, if you're able to reoccupy the building, which is what we addressed in the first action, then you still need to address the fact that the building doesn't meet current setbacks. And then we use the standards for variances and the requirements for granting a variance to help guide us, both the staff and the board. And that's what I was talking about with this, in terms of the staff's recommendation, is talking about the minimum adjustment necessary for the reasonable use of the land.
Mr. Shipley, I'm going to ask you a difficult question. And the question is, what do I mean when I say, in considering an application by a party for such variant or special exception, said board shall require the applicant to comply with such then applicable rules and regulations as would be applicable to new construction upon the tract or parcel to the extent possible? Do I mean, in saying that they shall comply with the front yard setbacks and the rear yard buffer strip setbacks?
I would say that, yes, because the parking lots and all that have setback requirements.
All right, so if the prior variance that we just granted requires that the applicant shall comply with such then applicable rules and regulations that would be applicable to new construction upon the tract or parcel to the extent possible, then part of what we need to be considering is whether or not what the extent possible is.
I think that's reasonable, yes.
And it wasn't a variance, it's a special exception.
Right, it's a different rule.
Yes.
Absolutely. But the rules, I think, required in that would be the rules and regulations applicable to new construction on that parcel, which
Yeah.
would be all of the setback requirements.
Yes. Then you got to determine what would be reasonable for the building, because there's a differentiation between site improvements and the building itself. And we talked about that with the special exception.
In a case where the building is what it is, there's no possible way that we could have an 80-foot from, which would be the west side. I think it's 48 now, is that correct?
Yeah, I think, well, I don't remember. You talking about from Way Station Trail?
Yes, way station,
Note 2 on Exhibit D.
yes.
Good enough, to be honest with you.
So there's no possible way that we could get with 80-foot setback there and still have a building left? As far as, I mean, you'd,
That's why I'm talking about the covered, addressing the covered part, because if you lessen the depth of that, then you do have an adjustment made to the setback requirements that brings the building more into compliance. You're not asking them to tear the building down, but you are asking them to make the minimum adjustment to lessen the amount of variance to the greatest extent possible.
well, the minimal is 2 foot in the back,
Yeah, it is what it is there.
and is what it is on the way station trail
East
side,
side and more or less on the west side.
and on the east side and the west side.
Though because of the angle in relation to the property, the right-of-way on Way Station Trail, that's where the 3-foot reduction in the amount of setbacks necessary would come into play, because the building, if you lessen the depth of it, then you're, because of the angle in relation to the right-of-way of Way Station Trail, the amount of variance needed is lessened by about 3 feet.
Okay. And we still have to put, what, on that side, sidewalk or
Yeah, it'd be a
Walking.
sidewalk, walking trail on both frontages, yeah.
okay. How much room have we got between the curb and gutter on Kingston Pike and the sidewalk walking trail? How much grass
I
strip have
haven't
we?
gotten to that. We haven't looked at it at that point. I mean, what you're required to
I know, I'm just
have
thinking out loud
is
here.
8 feet of a
Okay.
grass strip on Kingston Pike and 6, well, I'd have to look at what Way Station Trail. I think it's a local collector, so it'd be 6 feet of a grass strip
Okay.
minimum on that. If not, it would be 3 feet. It
3
would be
feet,
considered a local.
I'm trying to think of what the liquor store is up the road.
Oh, the Dixie Lee? I don't remember.
Okay. Because Ott's is not a good example. Okay. So really, the setback on,
Yeah, I think one thing I noted in the write-up too is sometimes these variances oftentimes run with the land and are not really. So what I think I would recommend, if you do grant any relief in this case, is that it be related to the building in its current configuration, so that we're not saying that you can expand the building envelope to the south or the east, you know, because it appears that there's kind of an envelope that's wider than I think what really the applicant's asking for, but I just want to be clear that it would be based on the building in its current location, which I think kind of relates back to the previous action about not expanding the non-conforming structure. But if they were to tear the building down and rebuild on the site, they would just need to meet all requirements for both the building and the site.
so it'd be 80
It depends on where they put the
35.
building. Yeah, I mean, the parking and yeah, it could be. Yeah. Actually, like I say, we've changed our setback requirements to give them a lot more flexibility than we had previous to our recent changes. So, there's some things that they have more flexibility. They just have a very substantial building in terms of construction out there. It's pretty much a big piece of concrete, as I understand it. Concrete and metal.
And actually, and I wish we won't be able to, I'd love to keep the terrazzo floors in there if you've ever looked at them.
No, I'd seen
The
that.
terrazzo floors are gorgeous in these places. We won't be able to keep it because it's kind of tore up and everything. But
Right, from previous coolers and.
coolers
Yeah,
and, Keith stumbling in, getting his beer and falling and,
counters and, yeah, okay.
So, Ms. Shipley, regarding the 58-foot setback from Kingston Pike, so that would be with essentially the town's recommendation of a 2-foot overhang from the front of the building in place of the current 20-foot? Is that,
No, the 58 foot's what would result from the applicant's request.
okay,
That's what their setback, that's where the building would be in relation to
okay.
be encroaching that much into
and
the
actually-
80 feet.
like I said, after Ron gave me the fabulous idea that we could take that to 62 feet, basically keeping it at the same point the overhang is at this point, just taking off a foot or so on the very end of the canopy so that we could get the wall to the outside of it. It's just taking the cantilever all the way back concerns me, so.
Yeah, I'd sure like to look at the plans.
I would love to see them too if I could ever find them. But nobody seems to have them.
None were filed with the Knox County?
That is one place I have not tried. I've just tried going through Weigel's. And and we all know that these probably were made by Southern Cast Stone, and Southern Cast Stone no longer exists.
Do you know if they have changed the way they build buildings since 1978 as far as the Weigels? Because then you could just refer to a new Weigels building.
Yeah, you said that they were building the same way, so.
The new ones are basically that way, and I asked them the plans and the cast, who was doing the cast, because these are pre-engineered. They just, the supplier of the vents provide them this. And I could never get that name from anybody of who actually does it.
So based on your comments, are you asking us now to approve a variance with a 62-foot setback?
Yes.
Change it, okay. So does that need to be changed here? Or if we make a motion, we'll just use the 62-foot?
That you could do
Okay.
it that way.
So what would the setback be based on the town's recommendation from Kingston Pike?
Based on the drawings provided, it would appear that the building would be roughly 78 feet, so it would be about a 2-foot
2-foot
variance from
variance.
the front, although I could be off a little bit because
Yeah, we're about all scaling. That's about, I agree with you, Mark.
Is that
That's
about
about what
right?
it is.
Okay.
Can you go through A, B, and C on the front? If we went with what the town is proposing, instead of a front yard setback from required 80 foot to a 58 or now 62 foot, the town's would be,
would be
78.
78, yeah.
with regard to B, the front yard setback along Way Station Trail from a required 80 foot setback to a
Be
proposed
about
48.
45.
About 45. And with the rear yard buffer strip setback from a required 35-foot setback to a proposed 33, it would be,
That would be unchanged. 'cause
it'd be 33 the
It's
same
really
because of
nothing
the
you can
building.
Yeah, and it's
Yep.
not,
Okay.
not affected by manipulating the overhang.
Sure.
This is a minimal, to me, it's a minimal amount of changes. based on what it is as far as where that building sits.
Yeah. About roughly 3 feet is what I determined on Way Station Trail. It's, again, like because of the angle of the right-of-way in relation to the existing overhang. If you take off the overhang, then you free up, your measurement point is widened by roughly 3 feet based on what I scaled off on the plans.
So I have a question with respect to the terminology reasonable use of land. So when we consider a variance, and this is my lack of experience on this board, but reasonable use of land, when we say that, does that only include the physical land as zoned, or does that include any structures on that land in that zoning district? So, for example, do we need to determine that, by not granting the variance, not only does he doesn't just lose reasonable use of the land for commercial purposes regardless of what's on there, but the structures that are existing on there, he loses reasonable use of those structures as well because we didn't grant the variance. And that was my question. Even if we grant no variance, the building is still not compliant as the way the structure stands now. So that's not compliant with the current setback. So do we consider the structure when we say reasonable use of land?
Yeah, you would in this case. Yeah, because that's what they're requesting, to keep the structure. The question is, if you make an adjustment, as the staff recommended, to provide for the minimum adjustment necessary for the reasonable use of the property. If they're wanting to reuse the building, I think you have to take that into consideration, is what's left of the building that's non-conforming. If you remove part of the overhang, does that provide you enough space for a reasonable use? I think from the staff's perspective it clearly does, because as I mentioned earlier, that space was used for decades as a Weigel's convenience store.
So
The overhang was just part of their design. It wasn't really necessary or essential to the reasonable use of that lot.
So here's the logic that I'm trying to follow, and I bear with me a second, because where I'm at with this is if the requirement is to remove 18 feet of that overhang, and physically that can't be done without significant changes to the structure. It's easier to destroy the structure. Is that removal of that 18 feet of overhang, would we consider that denying reasonable use of the existing building? And that's why I'm asking, do we consider the existing building? Because my understanding from our conversation on the previous item, economically, that's not feasible from an engineering standpoint, and I'm not an engineer, but from an engineering standpoint, that doesn't seem feasible based on the design of the building, that if you cut 18 feet off the front of that overhang, the building won't stand. I don't know if the building won't stand, but if that is the decision of this board, do we at that point deny reasonable use of the building? And that's, does that make sense? Does my logic make sense?
It does to me.
It does. Part of the difficulty for me is that in the application of the variance, it doesn't seem to take into consideration a structure that pre-existed the town, that was non-conforming before any of these regulations were in effect, nor does it take into consideration the fact that there has been a taking, expanding the road around that building. And this board has had similar cases, and I'll cite the Methodist Church on Grigsby Chapel Road, that road was expanded and expanded till it's up to the front door of the church almost. Right. And this board has granted an awning request to put over that front door that was getting wrecked. because it didn't exacerbate a pre-existing non-conforming use, but that's a different rule.
Correct.
And so, in this variance, it gets, you look at it, and it says that the burden, and I'm reading from Exhibit E, D4, it says requirements for granting a variance before the board shall have the authority to grant a variance. The person claiming the variance has the burden of showing. So I always look at who has the burden of showing me something. And they have those four things. I guess I'd like to hear a little bit from the applicant about that the literal enforcement of the ordinance would deprive the applicant any reasonable use of the land. So,
Well, can I show y'all an exhibit, I guess, to call it something
sure.
different? This Mark just glanced at this. He thinks it's close, okay? He wouldn't commit, he's very non-committal. This actually would meet the requirements of the city of Farragut. With the building this close to the side front. We're talking about moving it 55 feet diagonally to meet the requirements where we're actually sitting further back as it exists.
Into the buffer.
Mm-hmm. So this would actually, because this front line only has to be, because the parking is in the side and the rear, these only have to be 20 feet.
Oh, whoa, back up a minute. You're going to move the building to the front.
No, this is just an
It's a
example.
scenario.
It's just a scenario.
Okay.
If we were to tear this building down, we would actually be sitting by meeting the requirements of the city. I think these two parking places would go, yeah. I just caught that a minute ago too.
Lose the space.
It loses space.
Yeah, got it.
But in this, by having the parking in the back and on the side, we could be, I'm showing this 25 feet, but it could be down all the way to 20 feet off the property line for both front yards. This is the new property line, yes. From the new property line.
That's right, it could be 20.
So we actually could be sitting much closer to the front.
Well, you sort of mirror the southeast bank's design of being closer to
Yeah.
the road with not a sea of asphalt, which is kind of a desirable feature, but not necessarily,
We were originally that way, I'll tell you that. We were originally there.
I mean, that looks very nice. To me.
Well, I'm just using this as an exhibit to show that, we're talking about this overhang here, and all we're talking about is some parking places along the side that are out past the front, and some parking in the front, and being a lot, but not being as close to the roadway. This was just an exhibit scenario. I'm glad you came up with that terminology. So we're going from.
So your argument is that you all could actually the building could be closer to Kingston Pike, had a
Could
different
be a lot
design.
closer. If we tore that down, it would actually be much closer than we are now.
And we don't grant variance.
Let's get back to 4.
All right. So going back to Exhibit E, D4B, requirements for granting a variance before the board shall have the authority. So we don't even have the authority to grant a variance until the person claiming the variance proves to us, and you have the burden of proof, that the literal enforcement of the ordinance would deprive the applicant of any reasonable use of the land. If I hear from your demonstrative aid and or hypothetical new building, that would tend to argue contrary to that the applicant would not be denied any reasonable use of the land because you could do what you arguably had in your demonstrative aid. Is that correct?
Repeat that, please.
Sure. You would have a hard time showing us that you would be deprived of any reasonable use of the land if we denied these variance requests because you could do what you just showed us in your very attractive diagram.
But it would deny the use of the existing structure.
Don't say that.
Yeah, but it doesn't say it. You have the burden of showing us that it would deprive you of any reasonable use of the land, and the truth is it wouldn't deny you any reasonable use of the land.
As it sits, yes, it does. As it sits. Because it's an existing structure.
With regard to the back wall, I mean, I would agree with that. You can't cut into the back wall without requiring it.
As it sits.
Yep.
He's right.
Right, but again, that paragraph you're reading from the ordinance, literal enforcement of the ordinance would deprive the applicant of any reasonable use. It's not a specific reasonable use in the way I read that specific use of a building, a portion of the land, it's denial of any. So maybe a good example, and it's where I'm thinking of, you have a certain lot that you want to build a 3,000 square foot home on. But in order to build a 3,000 square foot based on the topography of the land, you're going to encroach on the setback. You come in for a variance and we say, well, can you build a 2,500 square foot house on that same parcel of land and not encroach? And if the answer to that question is, yes, I can build that 2,500 square foot home and not encroach, then the variance would not be granted. And that's my understanding of how we apply this particular, an example of how we would apply this particular part of the ordinance. And so by showing that you can put another building on there, move it closer to the front of the property, and be in compliance with the current ordinance and not require the variance, I think that's the point the chairman is making, is that is counter to the claim of asking for the variance for the existing structure. Am I?
Well, I think that's a good point.
No, I'll add to that in Exhibit E, subsection D3A, which gives us some guidance, and it says variances shall be granted only where special circumstances or conditions exist, such as exceptional narrowness, topography, or siding, fully described in the findings of the board, do not generally apply in the district. So, I mean, my understanding of a variance request was it always had to do with the condition of the real property. I've never heard a variance request having to do with the condition of an existing structure on the real property. So in determining a variance request, I mean, the rules appear to be written solely with regard to the land and not the building.
Yeah. And I mentioned that in the write-up. It's something that runs with the land and would be tied to the property. So if you're tying it to the building, then you'd need to be specific to that. I mean, they could reuse the building, I guess, under the previous action as long as they didn't do anything as far as expanding it, you know.
Exactly.
But that's not what they're wanting to do, which I appreciate what they're wanting to do as far as that goes, because I think that would be an, enhancement of what's there. But, you could reuse the building under the special exception approval, and you just have to bring everything else into compliance. Of course, that would include bringing the building into the architectural design standards requirements. So I think that would not be exempted from that.
But my question is, I'm having trouble understanding where you're saying we're expanding the building.
Well, what you have shown us is that you were enclosing that area and actually extending it.
But you said it was under roof, so it was therefore part of the structure.
Yep. Same thing I was talking about in the previous action, because when you start enclosing something, you're taking away the light and the space, and the reason for having, the bulk is intensified. So in my opinion, you would be expanding the condition of nonconformity, because you're taking the existing bulk of the structure and you're adding to a nonconforming structure, and you're adding to that bulk.
So can you tell me, again, because we've been talking a lot for you, but can you tell me how the literal enforcement of the ordinance would deprive the applicant any reasonable use of the land? So the key emphasis is any reasonable use of the land.
I would like for you to go back and reread the item that you read for item 3, stating that once the non-conforming building was approved, it should only meet the requirements of the code per not affecting the building.
You're talking about the last application?
Yes, that was
Special
approved.
exception, that wasn't a variance.
That's a different rule.
It's a different rule, but it says it's not to affect, from where I understood the reading of it, was that it did not, that the conformance would be to meeting the new requirements as reasonable for that structure, not including the building.
You can't say structure, not building.
Yeah, again, I think from what my viewpoint is, the difference is we were granting something having to do with a different rule about occupying the building, and this has to do with granting a variance on the building. So the two are somewhat related from the standpoint that we required the applicant to comply with such then applicable rules and regulations that would be applicable to new construction upon the tract or parcel to the extent possible, but not related to the building. So we didn't require any changes in the building in order for you to occupy the building. Now we're looking at a variance. And looking at the variance, we're saying in order to approve the variance, we have to meet these requirements, and the requirement would require you, because you have the burden of showing, that the literal enforcement of the ordinance would deprive you of any reasonable use of the land. So that's a hurdle we're trying to get over. There's actually 4 requirements that you have the burden, but that one seems somewhat significant based on the fact you've shown us a demonstrative aid that looks nice and looks like it would give you some reasonable use of the land.
I don't think, well, I don't want to say that. But to do that, we have to tear down the one that you just approved to occupy.
As it stands.
Hmm.
As it stands.
As it stands.
You can occupy it as it stands based on the exception. Now, we're past that, and we're into the variance that you want to change the way it sits.
No, that's not what we're asking for. We're just asking for the building as it, the footprint of the roof of the structure. As it sits. Remaining inside the footprint as it sits. The only variance we would ask to go outside of is, like I said, to add brick to the side to meet the architectural standards of Farragut. We're not asking to go outside of the footprint of the roof.
And I think this is where the town has argued that under the variance ordinance, paragraph D, subparagraph 3D of Exhibit E, states any variance granted under the provisions of this section shall be the minimum adjustment necessary for the reasonable use of the land. And so I think what at least my understanding of what the town has said is that minimum adjustment would be the minimum variance in the distance from the property line to the building, which would be 2 feet of overhang, and that's the challenge, that's where that's my understanding is what's being said is that's the minimum adjustment necessary. We can't make a maximum adjustment necessary under this code. We're required to make the minimum adjustment necessary.
Well, that's the reason I asked early on. We're into definition of building now. Your definition of the building is different than what I see as the definition of the building. My definition of the building is to the edge of the canopy, which is the full roof of the structure.
So Mark, do you agree with that definition of a building in terms of the town ordinance?
Well, like I said earlier, the definition of a building as we apply it in our zoning ordinance, and we define it in there because we want to address it the way we want to in zoning, and that is a structure with a roof over it. So that overhang is part of the building. As we apply it in the town, that may differ in other areas, but that's why we specifically define it that way in our zoning ordinance. Otherwise, we just refer to Webster's dictionary for the standard application of the term in question. But for that, we specifically defined it like that.
Okay, thank you.
So Mark, if we just gave him permission to occupy the building under a special exception, the non-conforming building, then would the variances not be mute?
I guess if he used the building just as it is and brought the site and all the aspects into the compliance with the special exception language, then, I think that would probably comply with the reuse of the building. That's not what they're wanting to do, but that's, I think, the answer to that specific question. Mm-hmm.
Well, it gets back to the definition of, if you're adding a cladding to the exterior, not adding any usable space to the outside, the front and the back, we can stay inside. If we change the brick on the sides of it, it might be, it's about 5 inches that we would add.
Oh, I don't know. And based on his drawing, again, I'm not wanting to base it necessarily on the drawing, but it does kind of enclose that front overhang area. And in my opinion, that's a clear violation of the special exception, because that's an expansion of a non-conforming building.
But by your own zoning and definition, it's not. Because it says building is what is under roof. And that is still part of what is under roof.
Yeah, but a special exception is granted only where if you're expanding, you can't expand it to exacerbate its condition of nonconformity.
Where are we? Where are we doing that?
With
We're not expanding the roof, period.
Well, enclosing it, I would argue, is an expansion of the nonconformity.
So, Mr. Shipley, if we grant a variance, we can grant the variance that will run with the land forever, but make it conditioned upon the building remaining the same and not being modified? Or can we not do that because we can't tie the variance to the building?
Yeah, you can tie the variance to the building so that, whatever happens is, to the existing footprint.
Because truly, if he's asking just to have the footprint of the building with the awning as the proposed setback, and we basically told him he can occupy it the way it is, then as long as the building remains that same, it's not contradictory to what we just did.
Right.
And it doesn't allow them to expand it or compound the problem in any way,
Right.
shape, or form.
That's right. They just had to bring the site into compliance as part of the previous action, right?
Sure. Well, and we could certainly, I think we certainly meet qualifications that show that there is an unusual nature to the layout of the land, to some extent, that it's smaller,
Substandard lot, yeah.
that it's a substandard lot.
Yep.
I'm not necessarily compelled that the building on the lot has anything to do with granting the variance. I haven't really been convinced of that yet, but, to the extent that we've already are allowing him to do that, in one, I don't know that it makes a difference, because if the building's changed, then granting this variance is of no consequence anyway.
Right.
I don't know that that's a good reason to do it, though. Does anyone have any thoughts on whether or not there's a reasonable use of the land if the variances are not granted? I mean, it sounds like if the variances are not granted, that there is a reasonable use of the land because they can use the building as it's sitting and occupy it the way it's been used as a Weigel's for a long time.
That's the way it reads.
Okay.
So, I mean,
So what you,
I would agree
what
with
you
you,
just said is that it is only to be used as a convenience store?
No, I'm just saying that in terms of a reasonable use, that there would seem to be a reasonable use of the land if the variances are not granted.
Okay, I just want to make sure you weren't just limiting to,
No limitations whatsoever.
okay.
No.
And he still can proceed with renovating, reusing, et cetera,
That's correct.
because it was granted with the special exception. So there's no reason for a variance.
That basically in the first motion, that was approved.
Yes.
That's right. So the argument would be there's no need for a variance.
Right, so close.
As long as we stay within the footprint of the roof.
As long as you don't modify the building.
Don't modify the building, so you're saying what we have there, we can't do.
I can't speak to that because that's not before us.
it's
Okay.
not- we don't go there. That's somebody else.
So, does anyone have any more questions or do we have any motions?
Do we need to deny the variance, or does he need to withdraw it?
You can't make someone withdraw it. You're welcome to withdraw it if you like, but otherwise, it's our burden to move forward and rule on the motion one way or another.
I would like to make a motion to deny the variance request because the applicant has reasonable use of the land without the variance.
I'll second.
All right, I have a first and a second. Any discussion? All right, call for the vote. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion carries.
So the city's going to play for the demolition?
Not before this board.
Not before this board, you're right.
Do I have a motion to adjourn?
A motion?
Second.
Aye?
Aye.